There's a particular kind of quiet that fills a house when someone is missing from it. Not missing as in gone, missing as in chosen not to come. The chair is empty not because they couldn't be here, but because somewhere, at some point, someone decided that the cost of being in this room was higher than the cost of staying away. If you've ever cut contact with a family member, or been on the receiving end of that silence, you already know. It's not something people do casually, and it's far more common than most people realize. Here's what's actually going on. In almost every culture, family is treated as permanent. The expectation is straightforward. These are the people you stay connected to, no matter what. Blood is thicker than water. You don't give up on family. Think about how often you've heard some version of that. At a holiday table, in a movie, from someone who's never had to weigh the cost of staying. But Cornell University sociologist Carl Pillemer, in the first National Survey on Family Estrangement, found something that challenges that assumption. Roughly 27% of Americans, approximately 67 million people, are currently estranged from at least one family member. About 1 in 10 are estranged from a parent or a child. And a study using nationally representative data from Ohio State University found that over the course of young adulthood, roughly 1 in 4 Americans will experience at least one period of estrangement from a parent. Fathers are cut off far more often than mothers. 26% of adult children reported estrangement from their father, compared to 6% from their mother. These aren't fringe cases. This is a widespread phenomenon that most people carry in silence. So what actually drives someone to sever one of the most fundamental bonds in human life? The first thing the research makes clear is that estrangement is almost never sudden. Communications researcher Christina Sharp, who has studied estrangement extensively, describes it as a communicative process, something that unfolds gradually along a continuum, not a single explosive moment. Most people who become estranged report a final straw, a specific incident that triggers the break. But researchers and clinicians consistently find that this moment is preceded by years, sometimes decades, of difficulty. Think of it like a bridge with a weight limit. One truck doesn't collapse it, but years of overloaded trucks weaken the structure, and eventually, one more ordinary crossing is the one that breaks it. The final straw isn't special, it's just last. The most commonly cited drivers are severe, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, neglect, apparent substance use or untreated mental health issues, and in many cases, fundamental clashes in values or beliefs, a parent who cannot accept a child's identity, lifestyle, or choices. But here's where it gets more complicated. When researchers ask parents and adult children to explain the same estrangement, they get very different answers. The American Psychological Association reports a consistent pattern in the research. Parents tend to attribute estrangement to external stressors, a difficult divorce, interference from an in-law, a situational crisis. Adult children, on the other hand, tend to cite the parent's own characteristics, a perceived failure to respect boundaries, a pattern of emotional unavailability, a refusal to acknowledge harm. Neither side is necessarily wrong, but this perceptual gap helps explain why estrangements are so difficult to resolve. Both parties are often describing a fundamentally different problem. A parent may genuinely believe they did their best. An adult child may genuinely believe that best wasn't enough, and both can hold those beliefs honestly, without either one being a lie. This is what makes estrangement different from a typical falling out. In most relationships, a conflict has a shared understanding. Both people know what the fight was about, even if they disagree on who was right. In family estrangement, the two sides often can't even agree on what happened. The narrative itself is contested, and the emotional cost of this process is significant. Research from the University of Cologne found that estrangement is associated with lower life satisfaction and higher depressive symptoms, and that the effects are substantially worse when estrangement cascades across multiple relationships, affecting ties with both parents and siblings simultaneously. Yet, and this is where the picture becomes more nuanced, Estrangement does not have only negative consequences. The Cambridge Hidden Voices study, which surveyed over 800 estranged adults, found that 80% reported some positive outcomes from their experience: greater freedom, greater independence, a sense of finally being allowed to define their own lives. One researcher summarized it this way: estrangement can be a healthy solution to an unhealthy environment. So, if estrangement is driven by serious, long-standing problems, and if many people experience real relief, why does it remain so deeply stigmatized? The Hidden Voices study found that 68% of estranged adults felt there was stigma around their situation. They described feeling judged, feeling as though they were contradicting a fundamental social expectation. And that expectation runs deep: the idea that family bonds are, by nature, permanent and non-negotiable. Psychologist Pauline Boss has a term for what many estranged people experience: ambiguous loss. It describes a form of grief where the person you've lost is still alive but relationally absent. There's no funeral, no casserole, no socially recognized moment to grieve. The loss is real, but it doesn't fit into any of the cultural containers we have for mourning. You can't eulogize someone who's still breathing. You can't explain to a colleague why the holidays feel like a wound when, technically, everyone's alive. And because there's no script for this kind of loss, many people simply stop talking about it. They learn to change the subject when someone asks about their parents. They develop a shorthand, "we're not close," that protects them from a longer conversation they've already had 100 times in their own heads. And this connects to something the research highlights about how estrangement actually behaves over time. The Ohio State study found that most estrangements are not permanent. 81% of estrangements from mothers eventually ended. 69% of those from fathers did too. Researchers describe this as a cycling pattern. People often move in and out of estrangement over years. Some reconcile fully. Some establish limited contact with new boundaries. And some re-estrange after discovering that the original problems haven't changed. And there's a generational dimension to this. One study found that value similarity, not extreme behavior, was the single strongest predictor of which adult children became estranged from their mothers. In families where values diverged sharply around politics, religion, lifestyle, identity, the risk of estrangement rose significantly. As the cultural conversation around boundaries, mental health, and autonomy has expanded, some researchers suggest that younger generations may be more willing to evaluate family relationships through the lens of reciprocity and respect, rather than obligation alone. This doesn't mean estrangement is taken lightly. It means the threshold for what people are willing to tolerate may be shifting. Here's what the research actually shows. Family estrangement is not an impulsive act or a generational trend. It's a process driven by long histories of harm, fundamentally different perceptions of what happened, and a cultural environment that often makes it harder to leave than to stay. The distinction that matters isn't between people who value family and people who don't. Nearly everyone who becomes estranged describes it as painful. The distinction is between relationships that can be repaired through honest engagement and relationships where continued contact causes more harm than distance. And the data suggests that this is rarely a permanent state. Most people who walk away eventually walk back, often more than once, searching for a version of the relationship that works. The ones who don't return have usually exhausted that search. They've tried the phone calls, the boundary conversations, the one more chance, and at some point, the math stopped adding up. What the research doesn't offer, and what no one should expect it to offer, is a universal answer to whether estrangement is the right choice for any individual. Every family is its own system, with its own history, its own wounds, and its own thresholds. What the research does offer is context. This is common. It is usually driven by serious causes, and the people living through it deserve to be understood rather than judged. Knowing this won't tell you whether to pick up the phone or keep it face down. But it might change how you think about the 67 million people navigating this quietly, and the complicated, painful, sometimes necessary math of deciding what a family bond is worth. This is part of a larger pattern in how modern life is forcing a renegotiation of relationships that previous generations treated as fixed, and what it costs when obligation and well being pull in opposite directions. This is the human frame. Facts first. Context, always. If this changed how you see something, subscribe. We'll keep going.